Welcome to our roundtable, Getting Students Back to School, Addressing Chronic Absenteeism. I'm Malika Shashadri, EdSource's K-12 reporter based in Los Angeles. Since the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, more and more students have been making their way back into California classrooms. But chronic absenteeism is still a serious problem throughout the state. New research from the University of Southern California has linked chronic absenteeism to mental health challenges. Today, we'll delve into what the research found and how best districts, parents, and other stakeholders can make a difference. Lastly, EdSource would not be able to bring all of us together for our monthly roundtables if it weren't for the support of our funders. A big thank you to the California Endowment and the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation for making today's roundtable possible. Now for our introductions. I would like to welcome Dr. Thomas Dee, an education professor and researcher at Stanford University, Dr. Amy Rappaport, a research scientist and co-director at the Center for Applied Research and Education at the University of Southern California, Jessica Hull, the executive director of communication and community engagement for the Roseville City School District in Placer County, Dr. Zaya Vera, an educational leader who works in the Zone to Grow and teaches adult and social emotional learning foundations at UC Berkeley. And last, but certainly not least, Jennifer Huang, a parent whose son was chronically absent from the Los Angeles Unified School District, but who is now attending regularly. A special thanks to everyone also working behind the scenes to help answer the questions as they come up today. And welcome to everyone in the audience. Now I'm going to turn it over to our moderator, Betty Marquez Rosales, who covers juvenile justice and youth homelessness, among other topics for EdSource.
Thank you for the introductions, and thank you to all of our panelists for being here today to share your insight. I want to first lay some of the groundwork for this conversation with what the research is showing us. Amy, you recently co-authored a report that highlighted a correlation between chronic absenteeism and mental health. What were some of the standout findings, and what does that tell us about how students are doing?
Thanks, Betty, and thanks for having us here today. So in our report, we surveyed a nationally representative sample of over 2,000 families, collecting data and information about how their children are doing. And they filled out what's called the Strengths and Difficulties Questionnaire, which is a 25-item mental health measure. And our results found what a lot of others have found as well, that mental health struggles are particularly high right now for our nation's kids. Something interesting that maybe wasn't available before is we're finding really different mental health struggles for different age and gender groupings of kids. So we're finding, for example, that teen girls are particularly struggling in the areas of anxiety and depression, and preteen boys are struggling more than other groups in the areas of sort of externalizing behaviors like inattentiveness, hyperactivity, but also lying and cheating and fighting. So these are struggles that teachers and schools are seeing in their classrooms and dealing with. But of particular relevance to this conversation is we found much higher prevalence rates of very high mental health struggle scores among chronically absent kids. So let me just give a couple of data points there to highlight this. So we found that among students with good attendance, 7% of them were in the sort of red flag zone on the mental health screener. But among those that were sort of on pace to be chronically absent at the time of the survey, 23% were in this red flag zone. So almost 1 in 4 kids who are chronically absent or on pace to be chronically absent are scoring in the sort of red flag zone on the mental health screener. And there also seems to be a particular relationship for teen girls and absenteeism and mental health. And so we can talk about that more later, but that's some of the sort of highlights.
Yeah, thank you for that context. Saya, your work is very much in that intersection of absenteeism and mental health, right? And so you might be seeing a lot of this playing out, right? You most recently tried a unique solution at Oakland Unified. Can you briefly share how the cash incentive program worked? And it would be helpful for the audience to hear which students were targeted, why you used both cash and a mentor to address chronic absenteeism, and what the results were.
Yes, thank you. And thank you so much for sharing, Amy. Those are really important statistics to understand the context in which we are working. But yeah, when I was the district leader, we had the opportunity to go through a design process where we centered the experiences of our Black, Latinx, McKinney-Vento, unhoused, foster, and newcomer youth to build a sense of belonging and agency and academic identity through meaningful relationships, because our current systems are not specifically designed with this audience in mind. And the strategy to increase school connectedness among this audience came from the students. They said, pay us to come to school. I've got to make some money. Like I'm sending money back. They said, give us a mentor. So I basically took their ideas and operationalized them. So our goal was to increase school connectedness by paying students $50 a week to attend school every day, check in with a key adult every day, and complete a Sown to Grow SEL academic survey weekly. And this way we could measure school connectedness by attendance, by SEL well-being on a scale of 1 to 5. How are you feeling? And by academic identity reflections. For example, what strategies did you try this week? And surprise, financial incentives plus regular check-ins with a caring adult and regular SEL and academic well-being reflections increased student school connectedness. Their self-reported well-being increased, their attendance increased, and it was pretty successful for this student audience. So during the first year, our student audience comprised of 45 students across 3 different comprehensive high schools. Before the intervention, their attendance rate was about 60%, coming to school about 60% of the time. And even at the beginning of this intervention, their attendance was scattered 1 day a week to 4 days a week, and it wasn't, super consistent. But by week 5 and week 10 of being in this program, they were coming to school consistently with a collective attendance rate of about 75%. But what is most exciting is that 63% of these students increased their attendance from when they were in the program, the spring semester, to fall semester of the subsequent year. So meaning the students who participated in this quick 10-week intervention at the end of the school year regularly came to school the subsequent school year with the absence of that $50 check. So the residual effects of this intervention remain strong, probably due to the relationships that they were building with the students and the teachers themselves, as well as building the habit of regularly checking in with a caring adult using those Sown to Grow reflections. For example, here are some quotes directly from the students. If it wasn't for this program, I wouldn't be in school right now. Communicating with an adult, you got to know them. Before, they didn't really know we were there, but now we're more connected. I learned about my patterns, why I miss school. So the key finding here was that the money incentivized the students to build the habit to come to school, but it was the relationships that they built that kept them there and coming back. So by regularly checking in with a caring adult is hugely beneficial. And when the stress was alleviated from the students, they were able to focus. You know what they used that money for? They used it to buy toiletries and food, gas, or they saved it. And keep in mind that this was not, we weren't specifically out to solve chronic absenteeism. We were solving for school connectedness and belonging among a certain audience. By listening to their needs, by identifying the root causes, we were addressing their SEL needs, their physical needs, and increased attendance was just simply a positive side effect when you create the conditions for student belonging, when you invest in building relationships. And that's what the program was.
And this was a population of students who were facing particularly vulnerable, difficult challenges, right? And we know that chronic absenteeism doesn't happen in a vacuum. There's a lot of external factors at play. That work that, Zaya, you have been doing of trying to figure out the best possible solutions is the same work that some parents like Jennifer, you've had to largely take on yourself in some ways, right? As the parent of a young student who was previously chronically absent, but has since been attending school regularly, and it seems that he's really enjoying it as well. Can you walk us through what helped turn the tables?
So I think, first of all, my son, our biggest issue with his absenteeism was due to a lot of anxiety, and due to some neurodivergence that wasn't yet assessed. So we were we were really struggling with that during that year. And the thing that really helped turn things around was pushing to get some help from school staff and getting really involved with school in the classroom and getting our son the help that he really needed with the therapist, with a team of just his pediatrician and his psychiatrist, and just basically attacking all of it from all directions. So that it was a very tough year of wondering what was going on with our son. And in the beginning of begging just to get school to help us and not taking no for an answer, and letting them see exactly what we were struggling with. And so once school really did step in to help us and communicate, and I really had to just sort of really get involved, and then getting a team of, like I said, his therapist and his pediatrician, and just really just and coming up with some creative solution through school to help him at least want to go to school.
Right, getting that connection back
Right.
in many ways. And I do remember you mentioning that you ultimately had to connect your son to an outside therapist, right? So not really, you weren't able to get him access to the school psychologist.
Unfortunately, no. There was such a long wait list to get him the help he needed on campus, so we had to get help from outside of the school. But we did manage to find an advocate at school to really help us come up with some solutions to get him wanting to go to school. So it was that sort of that caring adult connection that we were talking about earlier. That really was very helpful in getting him wanting to go to school, and didn't fight us and get going wanting to go to school.
Right, that persistence, absolutely. Malika, I think
Yeah.
you have something from the audience.
Yeah, we have an audience question that sort of is looking at this question of absenteeism and sort of reframing it, that maybe it has a little bit more to do with the adults than it does the kids, in the sense of, does it have to do with the fact that students, especially in the wake of a pandemic, after learning online, are not as engaged anymore, are not as interested in their work, are finding their classes a little bit more lackluster? Just kind of wondering what you all kind of think about that way to kind of frame and approach questions around absenteeism.
Definitely. I think that there are several factors, and I think that the adults in the building are extremely important in providing that environment. I mean, just like Jennifer was saying, I mean, having that caring adult was instrumental in getting her son back to school and wanting to stay there. But I definitely think like framing it as it's not the student issue. The onus shouldn't be on the students. The onus is on the system and on the adults in the building. So yes, I appreciate that question.
Well, and I'll jump in on that. We actually have some data on what parents think about absenteeism right now. And again, this is from a nationally representative sample of families. And we tend to find this over and over, not just about absenteeism issue, is that generally parents aren't very concerned. We ask about concern about their kids' relationships with peers, about their mental health, about their academic standing, and concern remains quite low. We had a bunch of questions about how parents feel about attendance. And we see mostly that parents do think that in-school attendance in person is important. But again, low concern about absences, low concern about missing school. I think the best statistic I have to address this question directly is among the students in our sample who are chronically absent, less than half of their parents are very worried about it, or concerned about it, I should say. So while in the whole sample concern is very low, maybe that makes sense because on average attendance is not, is reasonably low. even among the chronically absent, we have what I think is a surprisingly low percentage of parents that are concerned about it.
I'll chime in on that as well, because we definitely see that from a district perspective. There is little concern about small bits of attendance that is lost because they don't understand how it adds up. So 2 days a month, each month, is what makes a student chronically absent, that total. When you explain to a parent that number, they say, well, just a day or two here, how does that really impact my student? So I think it's important for districts to have important key data that they can share with parents to say, 1 day lost usually takes 2 to 3 days to make up. This number adds up to 10% of your school year. And if you miss that each year from TK to 8, when you start high school, you have missed a full year of learning. So putting it into a different perspective for parents, I think, is really important, because we do see that a day here, a day there don't matter.
I'll jump in and add, I've written about the prevalence of norm erosion, the idea that the value that parents and kids place on regular school attendance appears to have declined nationally. There's early indirect evidence for that I can describe. But I also want to take a moment just to contextualize the chronic absenteeism crisis within the broader context of academic recovery from the pandemic. So just briefly noting, over the past few years, we've seen nearly 20 years of test score gains evaporate. We've seen an accelerating youth mental health crisis. That's attested by, a declaration from the American Academy of Pediatrics, a rare public health advisory from the US Surgeon General. And at the same time, we're asking schools to meet the demands of academic recovery at a time where federal pandemic aid is expiring, and many schools are facing financial stress and organizational stress due to all of the enrollment loss they've experienced during the pandemic. So within that context, we saw, as students returned to school pretty much universally in the 21-22 school year, a near doubling of chronic absenteeism rates. They were around 15% nationally before the pandemic, and that was considered problematic enough that most states under ESSA instantiated chronic absenteeism as an indicator of school quality. We saw a near doubling to roughly almost 30% in 21-22, and those levels have stayed high in the most recent data. We appear to be still 70% above that pre-pandemic baseline. So many researchers like me are trying to understand the drivers of that, and there is some early evidence for this general notion of eroding norms around the value of school attendance. Two indicators in particular I would underscore. One is the persistence of chronic absenteeism. And second, we see that the growth in chronic absenteeism is much greater in places that kept schools closed longer during that 2020-21 school year. So that idea that being remote longer may have encourage parents and students to see less value in school attendance is part of what we think is going on here. But at the same time, I'd like to conclude on this by saying I think a lot of the public discourse around this is really unproductive, particularly among the terminally online class of commentators, because so much of it seems to be a kind of partisan relitigating of those school closures. And I think we're at a time where we need, particularly at the local level, to understand the drivers of persistent chronic absenteeism and be focused on the solutions I know we're going to be discussing in more detail shortly.
That is a perfect segue to Jessica. Thank you for that, description of norm erosion, especially, right? And sort of the greater context of the impact of the pandemic, which I'm not sure can ever be overstated. Jessica, I know that issue of norm erosion has been discussed in your district, if I remember correctly, particularly with the younger years. Your district, like most others, you saw a significant increase in chronic absenteeism. And what the district did was track data on absences, and you found that TK through K, plus seventh and eighth graders had the highest rates. So how did the district figure out and track those details? And why were those specific students missing so much school?
Absolutely. Thank you. So for context, before the pandemic, Roseville City School District had a chronic absenteeism rate of under 6%, so very low. In 2022, we rose to 26%. So in response, we launched a comprehensive attendance campaign called Everyday Matters in 2023, and again, we have renewed that in 2024. This campaign focuses on providing information to families and removing barriers to attendance. So for that data, we partnered with School Status to analyze it more effectively and provide targeted information and support to staff, students, and families. One key data point we examined was that those rates were higher in our TK Kinder and 7th and 8th graders. So during attendance conferences with families, we discovered that many adults of TK and Kinder students believe that since these grades are not compulsory, regular attendance isn't crucial. So they also might think that learning in these grades is not essential. So to address this, we are focusing on educating families, specifically of TK and Kinder students, about what takes place in those classrooms on a day-to-day level and the importance of consistent attendance for building a strong foundation for their educational journey. I saw a question in the chat, is there data that correlates missing in elementary school to missing in middle and high school? Yes, it shows higher dropout rates in high school. Those matter, and those facts are the ones that we're sharing with our families. For our 7th and 8th grade students, we identified several factors that contributed to absenteeism, including mental health challenges, disengagement, we've talked about those, the need for students to stay home to care for younger siblings when those younger siblings need to stay home, and the increased autonomy that comes with age, which sometimes results in students staying home if they just don't feel like attending school and their parents can still go to work. So in these cases, our approach varies based on the situation, but our primary focus is always on removing the barriers to attendance. So that could be sharing infographics about when is too sick to come to school, or connecting students with school, district, or community mental health resources. I think it's really crucial that LEAs have data not only on average daily attendance, which is what we always usually talk about, but also on chronic absenteeism, because knowing which students specifically are frequently missing school allows us to understand the reasons behind their absences and then provide information and early interventions, which, as I'll discuss a little bit later, have led to significant improvements in our district chronic absenteeism rate.
Right, and that's an example of a potential local solution, right? Figuring out what's going on, trying to address it, really personalizing those solutions. Amy, I know earlier you spoke about that research on how parents tend to think about their child's mental health, their challenges with chronic absenteeism. I'm hoping that you can add a bit more context on that. I remember us speaking about how it is relative to other youth, right? How some parents might think of it differently relative to other youth. And also if you could touch on what you mentioned around those details, what's impacting teen girls, preteen boys, some of that breakdown from the research.
Sure. So let me start with the first topic, which is that, we find what we call, and others refer to this as, the parent expert disconnect, that the experts are showing, as Tom was describing, 20 years of learning, eliminated with the pandemic, and chronic absenteeism rates doubling. But whenever we ask parents questions about their concerns, we don't find that it matches what we would expect to hear. One really great example that I have is we did an in-depth interview study with 40 families, half of whom were specifically selected because in the year prior they had expressed high levels of not concern, but that their kids had not been doing so great with COVID learning. So they were struggling at home, schools were still closed, et cetera. And so a year later, we're interviewing all of these families, and the most consistent message that we heard across the board, and of course, there are parents who are concerned about their kids, so I don't want to overgeneralize this, but overwhelmingly, we hear people are concerned about other people's kids. So we heard from rural families that it's the urban children who are most negatively affected. We hear from higher income families that it's the lower income families who are most affected. We hear from elementary parents that it's the high school kids who were, the worst impacted. We hear from high school kids that the younger kids in kindergarten are the ones who are most negatively impacted. So there is this sort of common pattern where we're finding kids to just generally be more concerned about other people's kids than about their own. That was one. What was the other question that you had?
Just a bit more of that breakdown of the research from the recent report of how that correlation between absenteeism and mental health, how it breaks down by gender, by age group.
So we actually couldn't cross the absenteeism data by age and gender. We have the mental health data that way because the parents fill out a screener depending on the age of their child. And then we know their demographic data. So we can look at these patterns. And when we look at these patterns, that's where we really see that the teenage girls are really suffering with this anxiety and depression symptoms. So that the SDQ screener, it has 5 different domains, and one of the domains is anxiety and depression. And we see that the percentage of girls who are high on that domain is very high. I think it's almost 20% of teen girls, but not of other girls, not of younger girls. And for sort of these externalizing behaviors, it's high for preteen boys, but not for other ages and genders. And then in the chronic absenteeism, we found in our data that of the chronically absent kids, they tended to be actually quite a bit, most of them were teenage girls. We had about a quarter of our sample was in each and age by gender group. So we had preteen girls, preteen boys, teen girls, teen boys, about 25%. But among the chronically absent, 47% were teen girls. So we have this sort of converging data, and then we have the teen girls with the very high rates of anxiety and depression. And so we did run some additional exploratory analyses looking, and there does seem to be a relationship with the anxiety and depression symptoms tends to explain away some of that gap in the gender. It explains away some of that fact that the girls are having more absences than everybody else. So there's a relationship here between the anxiety and depression and the absences, but there's other work out there that's exploring the sort of underpinnings of the absences, and it's clear that mental health has something to do with it.
Thank you so much for that. Thank you so much for that, Amy. We also have kind of an audience question as well to jump off of that and kind of to dig a little bit more into some research that perhaps has been done by you or others. So especially in the case of just like what research is out there that sort of compares absenteeism of students who are kind of in a traditional school and those who are kind of co-designing with students more real world projects where they might feel like they can pursue their interests or make a difference in their respective communities and just sort of find a greater sense of purpose while they're at school.
Well, I'll jump in to say I've studied some promising programs that seem to work on the margin of promoting student engagement in school. And this has included things like, leading math reforms at a Bay Area school district, the ethnic studies pilot in San Francisco, et cetera. And we see that instruction that seems to work on the margin of creating school engagement and a kind of like psychological integrity for students within the sometimes evaluative context of the classroom, it drives school attendance. It improves school attendance. And also, I think this matters in the current climate. I have some soon to be released evidence that these kinds of programs are also effective at keeping the students in the district, at stopping enrollment loss. So good, high-quality instruction is considered one of the foundational strategies for promoting regular school attendance.
Yes, I love that you mentioned that, Dr. Thomas D. We've seen the effects of ethnic studies in our rates of school attendance in San Francisco, and to jump on the qualified teachers and having teachers that want to be there, that stay there, is super helpful and impactful on students' attendance and SEL well-being. I know that in Oakland, we have a program called African American Male Achievement, where students take a class, manhood development class, that is taught by a Black male teacher, specifically designed for Black male students. And we see that students that take these classes have higher attendance rates, have higher social emotional well-being than students who do not participate in these classes that are specifically designed for them. So yes, I definitely agree that having, strong systems of instruction and content that is relevant to students helps them to come to school and stay in school.
To stay on that sort of thread of systems, there's this larger question, and to direct this one at Tom, but feel free anybody else to jump in. We did receive a few questions asking, how do you scale solutions or scale this conversation when it's so localized? Can you talk to us about how the work of addressing chronic absenteeism is being distributed? Who should be playing what role?
Yeah, I really appreciate this question, because if you look at most of the guidance, it'll point out that there's so many different aspects of school environment, school functioning that promote regular school attendance. The kind of foundational strategies are involving just generally good instruction, warm student-teacher relationships, belongingness and school culture. All of that can matter. And then moving towards more intensive tiers of intervention. Those are very common recommendations. And I think it's good for ideating solutions, but also I have a bit of a problem, or at least a kind of friendly amendment to how people commonly discuss this, because I'm seeing recommendations in the public discourse now about do all these things, do everything everywhere all at once. And I guess what I'm sitting with is the idea that this seems hopelessly miscalibrated to the moment for many schools and districts that, again, are confronting all the different aspects of pandemic academic recovery at a time that ESSER aid, federal pandemic aid, is expiring, and schools face other financial challenges. So the notion that they should do all the things seems really problematic. Seeing things like, well, maybe to promote attendance, you should fix housing insecurity or solve the American healthcare system. I think that's great advice for a state legislator or a federal legislator, but not appropriate for district and school officials. What would be appropriate there, I think, is something that takes a very intentional and local emphasis and lens on the problem. We could talk about what's going on in the aggregate, but I think local school leaders need to begin with a needs assessment and understanding what are the bottlenecks preventing regular school attendance in their communities. It might be school safety at one place. There might be a transportation issue at another school. There could be a particular economic or mental health barrier associated with a community. I think it was Jessica mentioned day of the week patterns, as well as the importance of parents' misbelief. So that beginning with a needs assessment and then identifying aligned solutions and then testing and evaluating them within your local context, within what we commonly think of as kind of a continuous improvement cycle. I think this is an important and underappreciated approach. I mean, we should militate against the idea that there's one single silver bullet that'll work for all schools, all places, and all times, and instead take more of an improvement science approach that looks for solutions tailored to local problems. And actually, I'm hoping, if I can make a brief plug, I'm hoping to say more about this at a webinar run by Stanford in mid-October. And I'll drop in the chat a link for that for if people want to sign up and be reminded of when we're rolling that out, because I think part of the problem is equipping practitioners to just read the evidence critically too, because there are all these different interventions out there that have been promulgated, but the evidence base underneath them is of pretty uneven quality. And also, it's not just that knowing what seems to have worked for others matters. It matters whether it's low cost and whether it could be scaled with fidelity. And that's where I think if I were to encourage people to leave today's webinar with one piece of information, it's that the most promising evidence-based strategy is low-cost, scalable parent engagement through outreach, through texting, through postcards. And also, I was really struck by something Jessica said, which is, something about how the way, and Amy mentioned this too, the way parents understand what's going on is part of what makes that messaging work. There's evidence in this literature that the design details of that outreach matters. In particular, if you tell a parent not just, oh, your child's missing school, they're missing school, and here's where they are relative to their peers. Making that social comparison appears to be really potent for parents because it confronts the exact kind of misinformation Amy was discussing. So I think being local, understanding local challenges, finding aligned solutions, and then testing them in inquiry cycles to see whether they're working is really important and the way forward. And again, really, and I think practitioners are simply going to have to privilege those interventions that can be done at low cost as well.
If no one has anything else specifically on that, I think it's a great foundation for the next few questions, right? Each of you have really thought about bits of this as you figure out solutions and figure out what to do to best support students. Jennifer, to really localize, right? How much more local do you get than your home with your son? What guidance would you offer to parents who have a child who's chronically absent, who also has a disability? Are there things you wish you'd known earlier? In other words, what would have made the process easier when you were getting your son the support that he needed?
The easiest thing would have been when I initially asked for help from school, then them taking me seriously and helping. It took a while for me to, like I said, just go in, constantly reach out to the teacher and reach out to the school. And so if that initial reaction would have been much more helpful, because then I don't think that he would have been as absent as he was. Unfortunately, part of the issue we had was his, we were talking about adult connection. He wasn't getting that at school at the time. And in fact, part of the reason why he was having anxiety was the lack of connection that he had with his teacher, and a teacher who was not very compassionate about didn't have compassion for a student who was not a typical student. So that was part of the issue. So I wish that the school had taken me a little more seriously at the time. But it took a while and we got there. So I would tell any parents who are experiencing the same thing that we did is trust your gut. If you know that something's wrong or something's up, trust it and keep pushing and fighting. And honestly, and it's hard because I'm a working parent and I know what it's like because you don't have the time nor the luxury of time to get involved and volunteer. Unfortunately, that's the only way that you're going to get heard. So you have to push, get involved as much as you can, and don't take no for an answer, really.
Definitely a lot to learn from that experience. Thank you for sharing. I know that we also have a district-wide example, of course, Jessica. Your district has come up with a few different solutions, right? You mentioned a few earlier, but there's also one that arguably, correct me if I'm wrong, but might be the most straightforward, simplest one, right? That is the creation of a roadmap and a glossary. Can you describe what those are, why they were implemented, and what the results have been?
Yeah, so our Everyday Matters campaign and webpage, which we launched just a year ago, are continuously evolving based on this real-time attendance data and feedback from our families. And one of the first pieces of feedback we received was, I don't know what this means. I don't know what this acronym means. I don't know what this word means. You're telling me that they're chronically absent. So what? Right? What does that really matter? So we created a roadmap and glossary for attendance notices, which consists of infographics that clarify the various attendance notices that families might receive, and then the terms that are used within them. So we recognize that acronyms are confusing, especially in education where we use too many of them. I will say that first and foremost, we use too many of them. We have to stop. So with this initiative, we aimed to eliminate the confusion. We provided clear explanations for terms like truancy, unexcused absences versus excused absences, SART and DART. And then the roadmap outlines the different types of notices that families might receive, such as the number of excused absence letters and what each one means and what it will then result in for their student, for themselves, what kind of meetings are needed, all of those. We distributed those infographics to families in their home languages during parent-teacher conferences last fall and also made them available online. And after these were shared, the conversations between parents and caregivers and teachers have been much clearer, ensuring that everyone understands the importance of regular attendance and the implications of those notices. I think every day we're trying to promote the positives of regular attendance and not focus on the negative of missing school, but the positive of attending school. And so consistent attendance messaging like this supports that throughout the community. I think a big part is also sharing some of those facts that I shared earlier, right? The 2 days a month, every year during elementary is a year lost by the time you enter high school. For communities who have families who take vacations or large sections of time off from school, either to visit a different country or to take care of a relative, and they aren't looking at the independent study options, we share that 51% of the school year is available for families, or of the year is available for families to travel, right? The school year is only 49% of the year. So you have 51% of your year to take that time off. On those 180 days, prioritize being in school. So all of these efforts really did improve our chronic absenteeism rate. We decreased over 44% from the previous year, this year. And while we still have a lot of work to do, your ultimate goal is always a 0% chronic absenteeism rate, right? We are really proud of the efforts that all of our staff members and our families have made to find ways to remove those barriers so that all students can regularly attend school.
Mm-hmm. I think everyone on this panel has either during this roundtable or in prior interviews mentioned the importance of communication, right? And here we have two examples where it appears to me that it has to go two ways, right? From the district to families, but also listening to families' concerns. And that's how you end up implementing these solutions.
Yeah.
Right. And there's also, I guess, another example of that, right, Zaya, with what you do in terms of tracking students' progress toward more consistent attendance. You've mentioned that communication plays a significant role in that. So how do you track that progress. If you can share a little bit more about that, and how can other schools, other districts use that information to personalize solutions?
Yeah, thank you for the question. And Jessica, thank you so much for sharing all those communication resources. I love the way that it's been reframed. Like there's only 49% of the school year where you're in school. So take your vacations during vacation time. So I love how you're reframing it for people to hear. I think that's really important, like the framing and the communication of this. But yeah, when I think about this question, I think about I don't want to say MTSS for fear of getting too many more acronyms in education, but I think of tiered systems of support for students. For example, Tier 1, all students should have a caring and qualified teacher that is invested in their well-being, checking in with them regularly, building rapport. Students are all doing weekly reflections where they provide insight as to what they look forward to in school or why they miss school. And for example, Sown to Grow systemizes this process of regularly checking in with students. And then Tier 2, the attendance team, the counseling team, the school climate and culture team, where you're focusing and looking at student school climate and culture. There's a team at the school where student attendance should always be on the agenda. So adults have a caseload of students where they are consistently following up with based on their attendance data and their Sown to Grow data, the platform that gathers weekly reflections and student voice. The student voice is part of these discussions and in these meetings. So this way, school leaders can take and use this qualitative and quantitative data and provide personalized Tier 3 supports. And those Tier 3 supports could look like counseling referrals, McKinney-Vento services referrals, home visits. They could do cash incentives with families. They could have specific one-on-one check-ins with students. But I think that having a system is super important. And just like Dr. Thomas D was saying, testing it and making sure that what you're doing is having an impact on students, like this constant iteration of, designing the system, implementing it, and then looking at the impact it has on our students. So I think that those would be some helpful strategies when you're tracking student attendance.
And we also have an audience question that sort of deals specifically with small, rural, single school districts, and those that particularly just have limited resources, both in terms of personnel and fiscally. So what would you all kind of recommend is if they were to kind of focus on 3 areas to focus their energy to help bring students back, if you were to kind of identify what those areas should be, what advice would you give?
Well, I'll jump in and say, just underscore again that I think the first strategy to consider is engaging families and parents through low-cost communication. I think if the state had been more active, it would have made sure those affordances in terms of attendance data integrated, say, with text messaging systems were available throughout the state. But, California is a place that's put a heavy emphasis on local control. And so it's down to our many districts and schools to navigate those challenges. So if you're asking me to consider a kind of school that says, look, I can't afford to pay the vendor for a text messaging system, and I don't have the IT staff that could help integrate the kinds of attendance records we have with such a messaging system, I would ask, can we mount some sort of more human-powered effort to collect data on kids who have missed 2 or more days a month, and just have staff send a quick note? Because that's actually one of the design features that makes that outreach so effective. When it has that personal touch, it's much more impactful than just a generic postcard or a text message. So I think for a little bit of staff time or maybe some volunteer engagement and a roster sheet of kids who might be failing to meet attendance targets, cash-strapped districts could realize the potential in that type of parental engagement. So that would be my single recommendation.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think parental engagement is mostly free. It doesn't take any money to sit and listen to the barriers that exist for our families. And I would say focus on the positive, celebrate when students are in school, those positive cards home and calls home it was so great to see your smiling face today. It was wonderful to see your whole family attend school this week. I would focus also on the positive, because when people are consistently celebrated for being in school, the family loves that support, but the student also feels it. So when they are missing, it's everyone is missing, Amy today. Why wasn't Amy in school? Let's all wrap around her when she comes back. And those are no cost solutions to really engaging the student and the family in the school community.
I'll just piggyback one more thought about the importance of communication, which is that one of the reasons we use to sort of try to explain away this parent expert disconnect is communication, right? If parents don't know that their children are struggling in school, then they're not going to be seeking intervention or support for their child. And we need to improve not only communication. I mean, today's webinar is all about chronic absenteeism, but there's so many other areas of education and school where communication needs to be simplified. The reading level needs to be appropriate. It needs to be in, every language that is in the district. Shorter communication, right? And I love these examples that you shared, Jessica. They're beautiful and visual and wonderful. But I do think we find over and over again, we've asked about parents understanding standardized test scores. We've asked parents about their kids' grades. We've asked parents about their kids' attendance, and every time we're getting these sort of underreporting of what we know objectively is true. And so we've also in our interviews, we had parents telling us that their teachers were not expressing concern about their child. Teachers weren't sending home notes. Teachers weren't flagging the child in any way, and the parents were the ones, and Jennifer, you're a great example of this, pushing and pushing and pushing for the attention that they thought was needed. So I think you're all on the right track with these communication recommendations.
And listening to parents is also one of the ways that you understand how a student who might be in a particularly vulnerable situation, housing, transportation, maybe they're in the foster system, right? And they're moving around often. These are populations of students that we know are very directly impacted in terms of their education. They might not be able to get to school for many external factors, right? And so that communication just becomes critical in those moments. We're coming up on 3 p.m. here, and we have thank you for your incredible insight today to, try to wrap it up in as neat as a way as possible. I'm wondering if each of you can briefly go around and answer this one last question. What is one main piece of advice for educators, parents, and/or school leaders as they continue addressing chronic absenteeism this new school year?
I would say trying to identify the root cause and understand that you may not have all of the answers, and you might not be able to change the whole education system, but thinking about like what is in your locus of control, and trying to understand and connect with the student, connect with the parent, connect with the family, just to understand their context, empathize with them, and listen. We each have a nuanced context that we should be able to understand. And school systems might not be super nimble enough to address everything, but we can do something, and we should do that something.
I think that's actually absolutely right. Beginning with that sort of needs assessment, looking at the research literature for aligned solutions that appear to promise both efficacy, low cost, and comparative ease of implementation. But at the end of the day, it's important to remember all research can tell you is what has worked in one place and in one time. It doesn't necessarily tell you what will work. And that's why I would also underscore that importance of thinking of it in an inquiry cycle mindset. We think we understand the cause. We think we see aligned solutions. We're going to attempt a high fidelity implementation and build a learning agenda around that so we can see whether it's working, and then confront a kind of adopt, adapt, or abandon decision. If it's working, scale it. If it's not working but can be fixed, fix it. And if you're wrong, abandon it and move on to the next compelling solution. I think we need that kind of rapid cycle, continuous improvement mindset to address the very, local nature of the problems educators are confronting.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And I would say my piece of advice for educators is to have a two-way channel for every single family. So that's going to be different for each family. It might be that you have a text messaging system or an app. It might be that you have an email address. It might be that you have an in-person meeting at your school site. It might mean that you have a meeting out within the community at a local Boys and Girls Club or place of worship or food bank, somewhere where you are able to listen to families about what their barriers are, and then form partnerships within your community to help remove those barriers for our families.
All right. In that case, we really would like to take a moment to thank all of our panelists, including those who have been working really hard behind the scenes, answering some of your questions. Thank you so much to the California Endowment and the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation for the support that allows us to have these monthly discussions. Thank you all so much for attending.